CBS News contributor Nicholas Thompson is editor-in-chief of Wired. He spoke with Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg yesterday about the social media giant's privacy problem and how it plans to solve it. Nick, good morning.
Good morning, Vlad. How are you?
So, Zuckerberg described this as a breach of trust between the company and its users. How do you describe it?
I think a breach of trust I think that's a very good description. I would also describe it as a Category 1 disaster that the company didn't quite recognize, as all kinds of other colorful words to describe the problems they've had there. But yes, breach of trust is a good start.
So during your interview with him, he sort of laid out his steps, right? How do we reel this in? They include investigating all apps that had access to this information prior to 2014. And also sort of restricting what developers have access to in terms of data. But walk us through this. I mean, how do you button this up? How long does it take?
This is such an interesting answer that he gave, because they announced a bunch of steps, good steps, right? We will look at all apps that had suspicious use of data. We'll make it much easier for people to change their privacy settings. We will limit the amount of data that most apps have. If apps want more data, we will require them to sort of fill out much more intense forms, right? All good steps. But what he also said in my interview is, that's not it, right? That's the stuff we're announcing now. And I think what's going to happen is that over the next few months, there'll be a lot of stuff. I have in my mind that there's a list of like 100 things you could do. And there's trade-offs in all of them, right? There are business trade-offs, there's trade-offs in user utility. And they kind of picked 1 through 5 because there's really no problem with any of them. Like, Facebook doesn't work worse if you do any of them. But we'll see how far down the list they get, because it's going to get really complicated. Because remember, critics of Facebook last week were like, the way to solve all your problems is to be more open. Critics of Facebook this week are like, the way to solve all your problems is to be more closed. So how do you square that?
Right.
You know, it's interesting to me that in all the interviews that he's given, including yours, he seems to indicate that not only are I guess the word would be foreign actors or people with nefarious intentions are trying to infiltrate Facebook. But he says that they've been able to identify that. In other words, you say it is a complicated issue, but I want to believe that Facebook has a lot of really smart people working there, and that they can see these things that we are all worried about. They can see them. They saw them in France, he said. So how heartened are you that they can identify these issues in the future before they happen?
Well, I certainly know they're going to try. They weren't really aware. They weren't really prepped. They weren't really on the ball in the 2016 election.
Because they weren't looking.
They weren't looking. They weren't looking, and they hadn't hired a ton of people to look. They will have hired a ton of people to look. They will be studying what Russia is doing. They'll be looking at other people trying to manipulate the election. But here's another interesting trade-off that gets at that, right? So the way they were able to tell what Russia had done was by looking at old data. One of the solutions that lots of people proposed for this problem is that data should be deleted fairly quickly. Your user data should disappear. Therefore, it's less likely to be misused. But if you deleted all your user data, you couldn't have found the Russia stuff. You wouldn't be able to track what happened, whether the Cambridge Analytica data got to the Internet Research Agency. So, A, I do think they are making steps to find this. B, complicated trade-offs in every step of this.
Do you think things will be implemented in time that we will see a difference for the midterm elections?
Yeah, I think that the mass manipulation, the total chaos, the sowing of confusion, the sort of the plethora of baloney news, I think we're going to have less of that. On the other hand, people saw how well it worked, so we might have intelligence operatives from every country in the world trying to, push their favorite candidate.
And I don't know if we, as users, have become any smarter during this process, really.
And
we seem
part
to
of
be
it's
just
on
as gullible.
I think we're just as gullible.
We should have our antenna out. The American public should have their antenna out for kinds of manipulation.
I remember last time you were here, you talked about the differences between, say, China and Europe and America in terms of who has control over the data, the government, the user, or the companies. In Europe, they're about to sort of implement this general data protection regulation. And so they're and that aim is to put even more control into the hands of the users. Do you anticipate a movement sort of like that here?
Yeah, so we are heading in a direction where regulations in the United States will probably be more like they are in Europe. They won't be as tough, probably for 2 reasons. One, we don't have the same concerns about privacy in the United States that they do in Europe. We don't have the same history of state spying, right? Like Germany had the Stasi. You can see why they really care about this stuff. We haven't had the Stasi here yet. Secondly, these companies are American. Europeans don't really mind kind of messing with them the way that our regulators do. Our regulators are much closer to them. So we have companies with more political power, users with less less agitated over this, you'll probably end up with weaker laws.
That's interesting.
It is very interesting, and it sort of goes to the discussion. You saw that tweet from Aaron Levy. He's the CEO of Box HQ. He said, you know, tech's about to get regulated. Probably a good thing. In his interview, one of the interviews he did yesterday, Zuckerberg also seemed to suggest that sort of regulating Facebook and other companies like that, he's sort of in support of it. He just doesn't know how it would work. But I kind of wonder, does a company like Facebook, Google, do they need to be regulated by politicians? And even when you talk about that, there's a divide. Republicans say hands off. Democrats say we got to get in there. Where's the answer?
That was, I asked him about this. I thought it was his most interesting answer. So there are certain kinds of regulations that seem obvious, right? We should pass a law mandating disclosure on advertising on Facebook that matches disclosure laws for television and radio. Duh. Simple thing. But then we talked in more depth, and he said, well, so where is the line about regulation when we move to an era of AI? When you have artificial intelligence, you'll be able to find false information, hate speech with computers, extremely powerful computers, in ways you cannot do now. So how do you regulate that? Particularly since, in the amount of time it takes Congress to pass a law, which will be, I don't know, a year to come up with it, debate it, and pass it, all of the technology will change, right? And so what he said is, you should probably pass laws that mandate certain kinds of transparency. You can pass laws that are sort of directional, but if you pass highly specific laws trying to regulate technology that is constantly changing and will be completely different a couple of years after the law passes, you're going to create problems. Now, that's sort of
it takes so long to get legislation passed in the first place. By the time the technology changes, if you believe that it changes every 18 months or so,
I mean, the core of Facebook technology is totally different. The way AI is embedded into all of their systems is very different than it was 2 years ago.
But I got to tell you, Nick, when we talk about, you know, regulation in the government, that makes me nervous too. I understand it's about how this data can be used. But I get concerned about, well, who will manage this data? Who will decide, you know, what's worthy of keeping versus what we get rid of? And I don't know if I want the government doing that.
Well, and also think about this particular government, right? So we do not really have an Office of Science and Technology policy anymore. We have almost nobody in the executive branch staffing up on technology or who's deeply familiar with technology. There are a couple of people, right? But this is not an executive branch. Jared is trying.
I thought he does have a lot to do.
There are people connected but you know, at least Jared's sort of in the age group that sort of came up with the internet and all this sort of stuff. But you know, we've talked before. We have a lot of much older lawmakers who are sort of like, they probably hire somebody in their office to tweet for them. You know. Right,
and it's going to be very hard to imagine our government actually figuring out the right solution. And we do not have a technocratic, efficient, tech-forward government that can come up with the right kinds of solutions. So I kind of think my ideal world would be a government that's really smart and really focused, works hard and works in the public interest and comes up with great regulations.
That's everyone's idea.
Well, if I have to choose, I like that. Sign me up.
But if I have to choose between a government that doesn't actually study these at all, coming up with regulations versus self-regulation, I'm going to choose the latter every time, right? And what I'm going to hope is that the media pressure, public pressure, shareholder pressure, internal pressure leads these companies to do the right things internally, and that we don't need some kind of Frankenstein mess that the government would create in its current state.
Right.
If doing the right thing means making less money, will they still do the right thing?
He has said that. And in fact, he said that on an earnings call at the end of last year. I will also note that their stock hit a high on February 1st. It's had a tough time since. Zuckerberg, I don't actually think he cares as much about money as some of the other tech CEOs. He obviously likes it, but he's pledged to basically give it all away to science.
Right.
He cares about power, and he genuinely thinks Facebook makes the world a better place. So I actually think on that particular issue, would Facebook take a financial hit to have everybody there feel better about what they do? I think he'd take that choice.
All right.
I feel good about this.
Nick Thompson,
feel good about this.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
You made Vlad feel good.
That's my goal every morning.
Thanks, Nick.